Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and wonderful to see so many here, and I gather there's quite a line for the second sitting as well, so thank you all for coming. We're here to celebrate the members' preview of our exhibition, Vincent van Gogh, His Life in Art, and I'm going to take you through the exhibition this afternoon. Before I start, I want to draw your attention to a lecture you shouldn't miss tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, given by my colleague from the Netherlands, from the Van Gogh Museum, called Nienke Bakker, and she is the lead curator in the Netherlands of this exhibition, and we've worked together to put it together. And she's going to be talking at 3 o'clock tomorrow about Van Gogh's enduring legacy. And that is followed at 4:15 by a concert over in the Beck building adjacent to the Van Gogh exhibition. I should say a word or two about pronunciation. I think most of this audience would call the artist in question Van Gogh. I call him Van Gogh, and our Dutch colleagues call him Van Gogh, which is too difficult for me. So I'm going to go for the middle course and call him Van Gogh, and when I lose my nerve, I shall call him Vincent. What we're looking at in this exhibition is the 10 years, the decade that Van Gogh was a practicing artist. I'm going to take you through that sequence. And I should say a little word about chronology here. In the exhibition, it's not exactly chronological because of the way we had to hang the rooms that were available to us. All the paintings are there, but sometimes the chronology is a little bit back to front. But in the catalogue, which I heartily recommend you purchase, the chronology is exact, and in my lecture I hope that will be the same as well. I should say also a word about the first room in the exhibition, which those of you who've been in it already will have experienced, and that is that it is not part of the exhibition proper. It is a sort of immersive experience where we look at an overview of Van Gogh's career, and we put up some replica paintings, and I want to stress that the paintings in the first room are not real, although they look scarily real. They are replicas designed to give an idea of some of the masterpieces that he was producing throughout his career. And for the real paintings, you have to start in the second room of the exhibition. But what I want to stress also is how important Van Gogh's letters are to this whole study of his career. He wrote something like 802 letters, which have been preserved and transcribed. And my colleague Nienke, who I mentioned just now, is one of the editors of the astounding online edition of the Van Gogh Letters. Website is down there if you want to do it, and it's free online to everybody. You can read every single one of the Van Gogh Letters at the touch of a button on your computer, and they are quite astonishing, fully annotated with all the paintings linked to the text. The letters, as you can see from this sample of just 3 of them, are not only written in English, Dutch and French, but they have small illustrations, mainly intended for his younger brother Theo, of the sort of paintings he was working on at any particular time. So in these letters we have the bedroom, obviously, top left. We have Daubigny's garden, which he painted in Auvers-sur-Oise at the bottom, and we have the potato eaters, one of his earliest masterpieces, in the letter on the right. And as I said just now, his painting career, his career as an artist, was just 10 years long, slightly less than a decade, in fact, from 1880 to 1890, and he'd lived 27 years before that, before he became a serious artist. And I just want very quickly to pick out 1 or 2 highlights of his pre-artistic life during those 27 years, so you get a tiny bit of background before we launch into his work. He was born in Zundert, which is here in the southern Netherlands, And if you want a little mnemonic, rather than go to from A to Z, Van Gogh goes from Z to A, because he was born in Zundert and died in Auvers. And he was born in this vicarage where his father was a pastor, and this is the church that his father preached in. And his father and mother moved around the Netherlands, and Vincent stayed with them whenever he could. At the age of 16, he was apprenticed to the art dealers of Goupil&Cie, which was run by one of his uncles. And it was thought that this could be his career. And he went to the Goupil&Cie offices in The Hague, in London, and in Paris in consecutive order. So from 1869 until 1876, he was working for this company. It was a difficult relationship always, because he was rather a stubborn and driven young man, and sometimes he upset his employers, and he never achieved the status of an art dealer that he really wanted to be, and he remained a sort of junior clerk in those offices. This is the Hague office of Goupil&Cie, and this is the Paris office. And you can see, I'm going to show you just the map occasionally when it illustrates it. And when he was in The Hague, this is a photograph that he had taken as a surprise gift for his father, aged 19. After working in the Paris office of Goupil&Cie, he decided to become a teacher. And he signed on as a teacher in the English seaside town of Ramsgate. We see a little sketch here of the seaside and one of the buildings in Ramsgate. And it shows that even from a very early age, he was making drawings. They're quite naive drawings, but nevertheless, he was writing to Theo and enclosing drawings from that early age. And then he moved to Isleworth, to the west of London, with a teaching appointment. And he was also a very fanatical Bible reader, and he wanted to become a preacher, and he preached at these two churches in the area of Isleworth. After his experience in England, his parents were still very worried about what career he could pursue. And so he was found a job briefly as a bookseller in Dordrecht, and then he decided to become a full-time preacher. And he went to Amsterdam to study theology, at which he was extremely bad because he wouldn't study. And so his studies of theology in Amsterdam were a failure, and no matter how hard people tried to teach him, he really didn't succeed. And finally, he went to an area of Europe in the southern part of Belgium, in these places called Wasmes and Quesme, which are in an area called the Borinage. And he there tried to become a missionary to the very poor miners that worked there. And we have a few of his works that he produced then, extremely naive, extremely rough. The Miners in the Snow of 1880, a Factory of 1879. And in the Borinage, he more or less almost starved to death. I mean, essentially, he had no money. He was giving away any money that he was sent to him. He gave away his clothes. And in the end, Theo took him in hand, his younger brother, and said, you have got to decide what you're going to do. And he decided then in 1880 that he was going to be an artist. And this was the beginning of the decade that Van Gogh was an artist. And so let's now embark upon that 10-year-long career. And so the first phase of it was in the Netherlands, around the area of the villages where his parents lived. And we were looking at the period from 1881 to 1885. And he first went to Brussels to study art in an art school. It didn't last very long, but he looked at painting manuals, he looked at artistic manuals, and the first thing he tried to master was the art of drawing. And this involved making copies of painting of artists that he admired, including Jean-François Millet, And in the first room of the exhibition, we have this very early drawing of Van Gogh's, which is a direct copy of the Millet engraving, which we also show from our own collection. And it shows that he's just simply trying to master line and figure from these studies. He then progresses, and following his parents around to their village in Eton, where they were then living, he continues to practice his drawing. And it's astonishing, from those very naive early beginnings, his improvement is amazing. And as we can see, in the next couple of years, he became a master draftsman. And it's no exaggeration to say that his learning curve was almost vertical. I mean, it's quite amazing how much he achieved in a very short time. With his fellow painter, Anton von Rappau, he visited the marsh near Eton, and we have there is another drawing by von Rappau of a very, very similar scene. And we can see he's beginning to master touches and techniques of drawing, using different materials, using reed pens, using graphite, using charcoal, and so on. And here is a study of his parents' gardener in Eton of September 1881, just a year after he decided that he was going to become an artist. He went to The Hague to study with his cousin, Anton Mauve, who is here, who was a very celebrated painter already, and he thought that if anybody was going to be able to teach him the way of painting as opposed to drawing, it could be his cousin Mauve. And Mauve set him various exercises, and some of the earliest paintings we have of oil paintings we have of Van Gogh are still live, such as the one we see on the right. This was an exercise set by Mauve, and Van Gogh was actually very pleased with it. It was one of his very first paintings, and Mauve congratulated him on it in a rather sort of half-hearted way. He said, "Actually, I thought you were rather a bore, but now I see that you've got talent." And this was the sort of painting that prompted him to say that. And Van Gogh wrote to Theo and said, "I've just been praised by Mauve, and I really think my career is beginning now as a painter." In The Hague, he went on perfecting his drawing technique, and he drew men in the Dutch Reformed Hospital. This was a favorite model of his that he sketched over and over again, just walking by, and Van Gogh would capture his beautiful pose in these sorts of drawings. This one done in pencil, and you can see a sort of slight alteration. He sort of just altered the length of the staff there to make it the perspective better. And then in 1883 to 5, he moved in with his parents in Noonan. He was still desperately poor, and he was forced back to live with his parents quite often, simply for economical reasons. And he went to Noonan, which is this very poor village in the Netherlands, where his father was the pastor, and it was in fact his father's last job as pastor. And he was plunged immediately into the peasant life of this rather remote Dutch village. And we begin to see paintings like the Potato Eaters on the right, which had followed a series of studies he did of heads of people in the village. And he wrote to Theo and said, "I want to make 50 studies of heads because this will be for my future career as a figure painter." And his friend Anton van Rappau, the one who'd been with him on the marsh at Eton, also came to Noonan at that time and was similarly engaged in painting character heads like this. And they were all leading up to this great early masterpiece called the Potato Eaters, which is today in the Van Gogh Museum, and which we illustrate in the museum, in the exhibition, although we don't have the original here. And it's essentially a portrayal of peasant life, the De Groot family. This is a known family in Noonan, eating potatoes around a table, and he's just depicting in this darkness and these sort of really quite brutal faces what he imagined peasant life to be. He was very pleased with it. He'd made lots of studies for it. He'd made a lithograph of it, and here was the final painting. And he showed it to Theo, his younger brother, who by this time was a fully fledged art dealer, and to fellow painters, and did not get the reaction he was hoping for. They said it was ugly, it was dark, it was disappointing, and he himself was very disappointed in their reaction. But today, we regard this as probably his first great masterpiece. Also in Noonan, he painted, and this is probably his second great masterpiece, the church, which was just outside the boundaries of the village. And in fact, just before he painted this picture of the old church tower in May and June 1885, his father had died. And in fact, his father is buried in this churchyard here. And at the time when he was painting this, the church was being pulled down, and by the time he left Noonan, it had been completely demolished. So most of the church is already gone in this painting. The spire has gone, and the rest of the tower was taken down in the succeeding months. While he was in Noonan, his drawing technique got better and better, and quite astonishingly rapid improvement. And you can see studies like this, the peasant woman cleaning a pot. This is a figure he drew over and over again. He loved doing the human figure in action in different poses. And here's a reaper reaping the corn, reaping the wheat, also drawn in the summer of 1885. Then Theo, by this time, the younger brother, an art dealer, as I said, had moved to Paris, where he was having a very successful career. And he said to Vincent, really, if you want to become an artist and you want to study the great avant-garde artists of the present, you have to come to Paris. So he then moved to Paris to live with Theo. And he went there on the 28th of February, 1886, and moved in with Theo. Now, at first they lived in a tiny apartment that was much too small for them, but then they moved to the apartment on the south slope of Montmartre, of which this is a view from the window. This is not in the exhibition, but it's a beautiful painting in the Van Gogh Museum. And it looked right over Paris. So here you have the city of Paris spread out below you, and that is those are the towers of Notre Dame on the horizon. And behind us here is the slope of Montmartre. And so his local neighborhood in Paris was the hill of Montmartre, the butte of Montmartre. And he made various drawings and paintings in that locality. Just by walking around the hill of Montmartre to the north side, he encountered the rather rural remains of the outskirts of Paris, the vegetable gardens, the market gardens on the north side of Montmartre, and the three great windmills along the ridge that were very famous. And so we have a drawing from the Van Gogh Museum and a very closely related painting from the Kröller-Müller Museum. And at one time, this drawing was thought to be a copy of this painting, not by Van Gogh. But it's now been proven by scholarship that, in fact, this drawing is an absolutely quintessential Van Gogh drawing of the period of 1885, and it is a sort of study for the painting in the Kröller-Müller Museum. At the same time, he was making still lives, and he loved doing flower studies, and that continued throughout his life. He became one of the great still life flower painters in the history of European art, and his sunflowers and his irises are yet to come. But he had early experiments with flower painting in Paris in a very colorful way. And of course we notice already that his color palette has changed utterly. From those early dark paintings in the Netherlands to Paris, his palette has lightened, has brightened, and he's discovering the light of Paris, and he's observing other painters like the Impressionists and the Pointillistes at work and seeing their work and meeting them in person. He was a friend of Toulouse-Lautrec, and he saw the paintings of Monet, and he was influenced very considerably by them. He met this woman called Agostina Segatori in the Café de la Tambourin, and the signature furnishings of this cafe are tambourines. So all the stools, the tables, the light fittings, everything else was tambourine shaped. And Agostina Segatoria, famous artist model, Italian by birth, was the formidable proprietor of Le Tambourin Café. For briefly, she and Vincent were lovers, and she allowed him to exhibit his works on the walls of her cafe. And here we have some paintings, some prints up on the wall. These are likely to be Japanese prints, which were extremely cheap to buy and which Vincent collected assiduously. And his brother Theo, in the art trade in Paris, also acquired a huge number of prints. And so here is Agostina sitting at her table, having consumed at least one beer, there's two saucers there, smoking her cigarette with her parasol there in this wonderfully fashionable outfit, and her hair swept up into red feathers on the top of her head. A very, very fashionable and terrifying woman. They fell out, of course, as Vincent usually did with friends and lovers. And when her cafe went bankrupt, as it did eventually, he still had a lot of works in her safekeeping, prints and paintings. And when her cafe was sold, unfortunately, those were sold with it, and so he lost those when the sale took place. Up on top of Montmartre, this is very close to where he and Theo were living. There is a street that connects all three windmills on the top, and that's called the Impasse des Deux Frères. And this is a wonderful example of how his style has changed from those early dark Dutch paintings. It's light, it's transparent, it's got a sort of feathery touch, and you can see how delicate his style has become. He's like a sponge. He's soaking up all the different types of painting. He's observing the Impressionists, the Neo-Impressionists, the Pointillistes, and he's reproducing it in his own paintings. And so he undergoes a huge transformation in Paris, not just in a single direction, but in all sorts of directions, while he's observing the avant-garde painters that he sees there. So this is the top of Montmartre. This is the north side. This is the south side. So Paris is over to our left. The northern outskirts of Paris, the market gardens, are over to our right. And we see just one of the three windmills here. The other one, there's another one up here, and there's an entrance to it just out of sight. And this is a little advertising model, probably describing nightlife, a nightclub in one of the windmills. They were used for entertainment, of course. It was in Paris that he embarked on a whole series of self-portraits. We know 25 or more self-portraits that he did in Paris, and here are just two of them. The left-hand one is in the exhibition. And obviously this was a wonderful way of capturing a physiognomy, of capturing faces. It was extremely cheap. You just needed a mirror. And so this is one which is from mid-1887. This is a much later one when he was about to leave Paris. But one thing that you should know about Van Gogh's paintings is that some of the pigments he used were quite impermanent. And he favored a very, very beautiful, delicate red called Geranium Lake, which, when it was first painted, was one of the most beautiful pinky reds you could imagine, but it very rapidly faded. And this became known later, but at the time he used it quite unknowingly. And so this painting here was much redder in tone when it was first painted. And in fact, the background, these blue dashes and dots, and the whole background was a sort of purplish color originally, which of course it's lost all its color now. The one on the right, which is not, alas, in the exhibition, but is still a wonderful painting, shows him with his palette here and his brushes and the little pots of oil and diluent there. He appears to be holding it in his right hand, and brushing with his left, but of course it's reversed in the mirror. We do know that Van Gogh, in fact, was right-handed. When he was in Paris, he followed in the steps of the Impressionists. He went out along the Seine and painted various locations that the Impressionists had painted, including the town of Asnières, which is one of the great favorites of the Impressionists, where they painted regattas and people swimming, and the island of the Grand Jatte, and various leisure activities of the Parisians at play. And while he was out there, he ventured into woodland scenes and painted paintings like this. And this is pure Impressionism. It's pure pointillism. This is Van Gogh soaking up the image of other painters. And in fact, this is probably very influenced by Seurat, probably very influenced by Monet. He's bringing all these influences together in the new discoveries that he's continually making while he's in Paris. And he paints this also in Asnières, the famous Restaurant de la Sirène, which features in all sorts of Impressionist paintings. The river is just on the other side, so all the regattas and all the swimming and all the jollity is going on the other side of this building at the river. And you can see that he's making all sorts of different marks with his oil paint. He was using dots in the previous painting. Here he's using sort of horizontal dashes, and he was experimenting all the time with how he could get effects with bright colors and light shining through. And the sort of calligraphy of his art is undergoing all these changes, and he's experimenting all the time. And this one is sort of surrounded by this sort of yellow haze of the afternoon sun. And incidentally, he used to go out to Asnières with Émile Bernard, one of his fellow painters, whom he'd met in Paris. This is one of the only known photographs of Van Gogh. Émile Bernard is facing the camera. Van Gogh is got his back to us. You may wonder how we know, but in fact, this is definitely confirmed as being Van Gogh's figure here. And there they are being photographed in around the same time that this painting was done. Eventually, he becomes tired of life in the big city. Paris has been the most wonderful sort of stimulus to him. He's had wonderful influences. He's lived with Theo. He's been very happy there, and he's produced some extraordinary new, innovative works there. But he decides that he's had enough of the big city. He wants to move south in search of sunshine, in search of new experiences, and in search of Japan, which sounds rather odd. He was very, very keen on Japanese art, on Japanese woodblock prints, and he sensed that if he moved to the south of France, he would encounter landscapes that were rather similar to those he imagined existed in Japan. And so in February 1888, he then moved south to Provence to the small city of Arles. And here is a map of Arles, and I just want to point out some of the famous locations in Arles to you, so when they appear on the screen you'll know where they are. Essentially, the famous Yellow House is on the Place Lamartine, and we're going to discuss the Yellow House later, and that's on that corner there. The Café de la Gare, and we're going to meet the proprietor of the Café de la Gare later. We're going to meet the proprietor of the Hotel Restaurant Carrel there. We're going to look at the Langlois Bridge, which is over this little canal down here. And we're going to look at the Place du Forum, which is here. So you can see it's quite a small town or small city, and it has other great features like the arena. And he was painting in and around this town for the next period of time. And it's on the Rhone River, so it's on a major river, but it also has these small canals which go off it. And you have to look from the Place Lamartine. There's a road that goes right up beside the Yellow House, the Avenue de Montmartre, and we're going to be looking at that as well a little bit later. Here's the larger map of Arles in the south of France, and Montmartre, which we're going to be mentioning soon, is here. Tarascon, which we're also going to mention, is up there on the Rhone River, And down here is Sainte Marie de la Mer on the Mediterranean. So commit that to memory, and we shall look at some of the places that he painted. When he arrived in Arles by train from Paris in February 1888, he arrived in the coldest weather that had been around in Arles for 60 years, and it had been snowing in Arles. This is in the south of France. And so snow was on the ground. He was quite surprised, not to say shocked, but he wrote immediately to Theo saying, it's been snowing here, but I've already painted 3 paintings. One is a street scene, one is a park, and one is an old Elysian. And this is the old Elysian referred to in that letter. She's called Elizabeth Garcia, and she is the mother of the proprietor of the Hotel Carrel that we mentioned just now. So he lived in this hotel when he started there, and he painted Elizabeth Garcia as one of his first portraits there. And you can see that his style has moved on yet again. That sort of divided touch that we saw in Paris, all those dots and dashes and calligraphy, has given way to something solid and brilliant. And so here she is, illuminated. It's a winter day, there's snow on the ground outside, but she's sort of illuminated by this sort of brilliant Provençal light. And this old woman, and she couldn't be more different from those character heads that we saw that he was painting in Noon, and those dark, craggy peasant heads that he was painting there. Now it's full of light and colour and depth. He then moved around Arles and painted various locations, including the Langlois Bridge, which you remember was over that little canal off the Rhone, and we're very happy to have this loan from the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne. This is one of 4 paintings he made of this particular bridge. It's very like the bridges you would have seen in the Netherlands, these drawbridges. But he never painted them there, but he painted them here in southern France. And it's this wonderful portrayal of the bridge, woman with a parasol, man with a horse and cart, and very simple composition. Now, we know that he used sort of artificial aids a little bit when he was painting, and he had been doing that in Paris, and he's certainly doing it here. And he used something called a perspective frame. And this consists of a wooden framework with stretched strings, and you can see I've superimposed it on the painting itself. And this enabled him to set down a composition very accurately. So what he would do is he would set up his perspective frame, he would draw those same lines lightly on the canvas, setting out the segments. He would actually lay the frame on the canvas and just draw around it. And then he would copy the composition segment by segment, and that made sure that he had an accurate portrayal with true perspective and true scale of the composition in front of him. And if we look at some of his paintings with technology, with infrared photography, we can actually detect these lines under the paint surface, and they are very prominent in technical photography on this painting. And so what he would do is he would sketch in section by section, and then later on come and paint over the top of it. And sometimes he just leaves little bits of his underdrawing of the initial drawing visible, and they peep through the paint. And if you look very closely, without offending the guards in the exhibition, you can see that the horse here, of the horse and carriage, is a complete sort of gap in the paint. You're actually looking through to the drawing underneath, and it's actually just his initial sketch is showing there. In June of very late May, early June of 1888, he travelled south and saw the Mediterranean for the first time. And he went to the town of Sainte Marie de la Mer, which I showed you on the bigger map that was over here on the left. And he saw the Mediterranean. He painted 2 views of the sea itself and 1 view of the town from the north side, so that you don't actually see the sea, but it's over there. It's on the other side of these buildings. And this is one of his great paintings of this period. He was always interested in perspective, not only with his perspective frame, but he loved the idea of sort of converging orthogonals all going to a vanishing point. And some of his early drawings in The Hague are very perspective perfect. And this is no exception. So he's got all these lavender-coloured bushes, which may or may not be lavender, they may be flax, pointing inexorably to the centre point of the church here in the town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. And this is one of his beautiful early landscapes in Arles, and he describes the sky in Provence, and he's never seen anything like it before. He's been living in the northern Europe, in England, in France, and suddenly he's got this amazing light in Provence. And he describes the sky, which I think this illustrates as the green blue of the sky heated white hot, he describes it. And this is, I think, a wonderful example of that. He also paints two seaside scenes in the same trip, and this is one he did on the beach over the other side of the town, and it has grains of sand in the paint. So it was a windy day, sand was blowing around and embedded itself into the paint. We find this more than once. Monet, when he was painting in Trouville, also had sandy pictures, and it's not that unusual. A very interesting little fact here is that he's signed it here in red, and there's something you should look out for, not only in Van Gogh but also in Impressionist paintings, and that is when they sign with a different colour. They have this rather alien colour on their brush, and they can't resist just using up the colour somewhere else on the picture. And so he signed it here, and then he's put a couple of little red accents on the boat up there. And this is an example of one of those sort of fortuitous events. This is the painting that we have here in Houston. It's called The Rocks, and it's in the Audrey Jones-Beck collection, and is a wonderful painting. And we know that it is in the location of Montmartre, and I will tell you where Montmartre is in a moment. It is the site of one of Van Gogh's frequent walks out from Arles, which he made with his painting gear slung on his back, and he would make drawings and paintings over in this location. You remember that when I showed you the yellow house, the map, there was a road going up the side of it called the Rue de la Montmartre, and that is where he walked about 5 miles across the plain to these foothills of the Alpilles Mountains, and he would encounter this rocky outcrop with a ruined monastery and castle on it. This is another painting he made in that same location, so I'm going to go back here. And it was made probably within 2 or 3 days of this one. They're almost simultaneous, these paintings. And this is a painting that the Van Gogh Museum recently reattributed with our assistants here in Houston, because we analysed the pigments on our painting, they analysed the pigments on their painting, and they're absolutely identical. The palette is the same, and although the distribution is obviously very different, they are painted at more or less the same time. And this is a view of Montmartre in which the ruins of the abbey and the castle are just visible over there on the left. So he would walk across the plain, he would climb up to the ruins, he would make studies of just rocky hillsides or even some with the ruins, and this was he made many works of art, drawings and paintings like this. Here is the famous harvest of June 1888, and this is, we have our back to Arles, our back to the small city of Arles, and this is the plain he would walk across to Montmartre, and there on that hillside is that ruined abbey and castle that we saw in the previous slide. So this is one of the Van Gogh Museum's greatest treasures, and that is the Montmartre there. And these are some of the drawings he did, both from and of Montmartre. That is the drawing for our painting, which is in a private collection. That is a drawing of the rock of Montmartre, which is close by. That is a drawing of the abbey and the ruined castle on the hilltop. And this is from the hilltop looking back towards Arles, with the spires of Arles on the horizon. Then, of course, we have to think about the famous Yellow House. He got to Arles in February 1888, and on May the 1st, he signed the lease, and he stayed in hotels until September. But in May, he signed the lease on this little house here, the famous Yellow House, which he depicts in this very famous painting. This is the road, the Route de Montmartre here, which is the road out towards the previous location. The Yellow House survived until 1944. There's a photograph of it earlier in the 20th century. There's a photograph of it on June the 25th, 1944, after a stray bomb in the Second World War destroyed it. So it's not there to be seen anymore, alas. But this was a house that he rented with a very specific purpose in mind, and this was to set up a sort of artists' cooperative, a sort of artists' community, which he called the Studio of the South. And he would invite, this was his idea, that he would invite artists to join him there, and they would produce art together, and it would be a wonderful collaboration. And all this time he was writing to Paul Gauguin and saying, please come and join me, please come and join me. Gauguin produced excuse after excuse, but in the end he came, and he arrived in October. But before that, before he arrived, Van Gogh had the idea of decorating the house with canvases of various themes to welcome Gauguin to Arles. And there's by the way, the Route de la Montmartre, and there it is in one of his letters. And the letters are so important. I mentioned them at the beginning. They're mentioned all the way through the catalogue. We mentioned them all the way through the exhibition. And you can get clues to virtually all the paintings and drawings he's done through the letters. And so this is the sort of typical letter showing a painting he's just been working on, just like that. But before Gauguin arrives, he decides that he's going to decorate the house with a series of large canvases. These are size 30 canvases. They're among the largest he ever painted, and he painted at least 15 of them in order to decorate the interior of the Yellow House to welcome Gauguin. And these are two of them, the ploughed fields from the Van Gogh Museum and the green vineyard from the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo. And this was painted in September 1888, painted in October 1888, and Gauguin was to arrive on October the 23rd. So this is an exercise that he's doing right up until the arrival of Gauguin in the Yellow House. So of the 15 or more paintings that he produced for the Yellow House decoration, we have these two, which are absolutely extraordinary, by the way, and they do not reproduce well. And I urge you to not look at them printed in books or on the screen, to go and see them in the exhibition, because they are astonishing pictures. The green vineyard has these great tendrils of paint and all these figures here, and it's utterly three-dimensional, this painting. And his use of paint here, and indeed here, the sky here is amazing, are revelations when you see them in reality. And he painted this one, the stagecoach, the Tarascon stagecoach. This was, and we have therefore 3 of the 15 paintings that he made for the Yellow House, all of this large format, size 30 canvas. And this is a very famous Van Gogh, which is normally in the Princeton University Art Museum. Here again, he described it to Theo and drew a little sketch of it in one of the letters of October 13th, 1888. And he says in the letter, do you remember that novel I keep telling you to read, Tartarin de Tarascon by Alphonse Daudet, a very famous novel of the time, and it describes a family in Tarascon, and in the novel there's this strange episode where the old stagecoach, the Diligence de Tarascon, is talking. An inanimate object is talking to one of the main characters, and he says, "You remember that scene? Well, I've just painted that stagecoach. It's in the yard of the inn. It's red and green, and here, this is what it looks like," he says in the letter, and this is the painting that he made in October 1888, just before the arrival of Gauguin about 10 days later. So we have all these paintings that would have greeted Gauguin when he arrived. So Gauguin arrives at the end of October, and they work together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not. And they move around Arles, painting various locations, the great Alice Camp graveyard on the old Roman graveyard on the east side of the city, and so on. And they also paint this man, who is probably Joseph Michel Genoux. We are not totally certain, but that's who we think he is. And he was the proprietor of the famous Night Cafe in Arles. And his wife, if you know your Van Gogh very well, was the famous Elysian. If you look up your Van Gogh literature and look for l'Elysienne, it's his wife. And so Van Gogh painted him, and it's this very strange portrayal of this rather smartly dressed man looking down his nose at you. It's a wonderful, wonderful portrait. But what makes it even more interesting is that when he was painting it, Gauguin was sitting beside him. He was sitting next to him, just to his left, and painting the same man at the same time in the same pose. And so there is the portrait by Gauguin, which is in the Van Gogh Museum, and you can see it's the same person in the same pose with the same clothes on. And so we have two identical simultaneous portraits. Of course, then the atmosphere in the Yellow House becomes tempestuous, and fantastic arguments between Van Gogh and Gauguin. And in December 23rd, 24th, is the famous incident where Van Gogh cuts his left ear. Most of it he severs. And he's rushed to hospital the next morning, and it's the hospital in Arles. Theo rushes to his side from Paris. Gauguin is around for a little while, but then makes a rapid exit because Van Gogh has actually threatened him, Gauguin, with the same razor he used to cut off his ear. So it's not a very happy situation. So he's bandaged up. He spends some time in the hospital in Arles, and he comes out of hospital in January, and he needs to get back to painting. And this is the painting he uses as his way back to the easel, as it were. And it's a very symbolic painting. It's a plate of onions, it's a letter from Theo, it's a book about health, and a bottle of absinthe, but it has symbols of this relationship that has just ended, basically, him and Gauguin. So here is a pipe with tobacco, and here is a lighted candle. And if we look back at two paintings he'd made earlier of the chairs of the artist and Paul Gauguin, of Van Gogh's chair and Paul Gauguin's chair, we can see where these symbols come from. So there is Gauguin's chair, there, which is in the Van Gogh Museum, and there's the lighted candle, which relates to that. There is Van Gogh's chair, which is in the National Gallery in London, and there's the pipe and tobacco there. So he's using these as symbols of a relationship which has just come to an end. But this is an extraordinary and important painting in Van Gogh's life. One of the characters he met in Arles, of course, was the postman Roulin, Joseph Roulin, and we have this beautiful drawing from a private collection, which is done with reed pen and brush, one of his great drawings, and along here are color notes for the colors that he's going to use in the large painting that relates to it. And there's something that a bit of a mystery about Van Gogh, and that is he produced in certain cases about 25 compositions throughout his career. He produced something that he called repetitions, and he takes the same composition and he then reproduces it himself as a sort of discipline. There are various reasons for him doing it, but with Roulin, he produced 6 paintings and 3 drawings of the same figure. And it's so unusual is this and so mysterious that in earlier times these were thought to be copies by other hands, by forgeries, but in fact they're not. They're all by Van Gogh. They're all repetitions that he has made for those various reasons. Sometimes as a discipline to himself, sometimes he revisits a theme much later on. When he painted the bedroom in Arles, he actually made 2 replicas quite a lot later. And sometimes he just produces them because he wants to send one to Theo and he wants to give another one to the postman's wife, and so on. So there are various rationales behind this, but it rather contradicts the idea of Van Gogh as a sort of wild, impetuous, impulsive painter, because he had this sort of discipline that he could produce these sorts of repetitions in a very, very disciplined way. Before we leave Arles, we should just mention 2 of the greatest drawings he ever did, which we happen to have in our exhibition. And one is the Place de la Forum, and you remember I pointed out the cafe there on the, in the city map of Arles. And this is the wonderful weeping tree from the Art Institute of Chicago. This one is from the Dallas Art Museum. And these are 2 drawings in wonderful condition, done with reed pens mainly, and showing just how brilliant he was in this medium. And just think back to those early naive drawings in the Vorinage or in Brussels, and think how far he's come to be able to draw like this. This is a day scene of the famous Café Terrace, and of course he painted a night scene of it as well, which shows brilliant stars in the sky up here. Then he decides that he has various recurring bouts of anxiety and instability. He goes back into the hospital in Arles, and finally he decides that he's got to go into somewhere more suitable, more permanent. And so he goes north, he crosses over the Alpilles Mountains, and on the 8th of May, 1889, he voluntarily commits himself to the mental institution, the psychiatric clinic in Saint-Remy. And this is an aerial photograph of it. And this is a painting in the Van Gogh Museum of one of the room he used to paint in when he was there. So these are the Alpilles Mountains here. Arles is on the other side of those. He's literally seeing the same mountain range from the other side in Saint-Remy. Here is the room that he occupied there. And in this wing, he had this studio there. And in here is the famous garden that he painted over and over again. At first, he wasn't allowed out. He was considered it would be safer to keep him within the walls of the institution, and so he looked for themes and scenes to paint without leaving the hospital. And he produced these wonderful, wonderful garden scenes in May 1889, as soon as he got there. And this is one of the finest from the Kröller-Müller Museum, and it shows the sort of slightly unkempt garden that he loved so much, and this amazing firework explosion of tree blossom at the top here, and all the different types of bushes and plants. It was here that he painted the famous irises. This is a period when he's about to produce some of his most famous works. He's going to produce the Starry Night here in Saint-Remy, and he's going to produce the irises. And he's working on amazing things, paintings like this too. All the different textures, all the different types of brushwork, he's brought together all that experience in this. And again, in reproduction, this doesn't look very interesting. Go and look at it in the exhibition. It is absolutely astonishing, the brushwork on this picture. Eventually, he's allowed out of the hospital, usually accompanied by a nurse or a custodian, and he goes to the foothills of the Alpilles that we saw in the background of the photograph, and he studies the mountains, rocks, and this particular quarry he painted twice, and this is a version he painted in June of 1889, and he was engaged on this when he suddenly felt and he describes it in a letter to Theo, he suddenly felt the most terrible anxiety. He had a total panic attack. And he finished the painting, but rushed back inside the hospital with his companion, and was actually stopped painting for a while. They took his paints away from him, so that he couldn't paint for a while he recovered. But so this is another of those paintings that has a very significant a moment in his life. He painted the clogs in Saint-Remy. You know, he began to get back to sort of little domestic paintings. He was again starting to paint compositions after Millet and Delacroix as sort of therapy. He was using small-scale paintings like this in order to get back in. This has been variously interpreted as representing his journey, perhaps various walks he would do, or it might simply be that these were objects that fascinated him, and the textures were something he just wanted to set down on canvas. And of course, we have the famous irises, one of the last pictures he did in Saint-Remy, and in May 1890, when he was just about to leave the psychiatric institution. So he'd been there a year when he painted this, and it is one of his great masterpieces. It's one of the great still lives in European art. And he loved the irises. There's the great version in the Getty Museum, which he painted some months earlier. And then there's this, where they're growing, incidentally. But then there's this in the vase. The wonderfully sort of soft blossoms, the sharp, spiky green leaves, this broken stem here, and the complementary contrast, which we should not forget. He was always interested in colour, and he wanted to make complementary contrast. And the complementary contrast here is lost, because these would have been rather more purple in colour. That red pigment, geranium lake, has faded here, and so the purple colour of the irises has somewhat diminished. And so purple and yellow are complementary contrasts, and they would have sparked off each other even more than they do today. Then he decided that he would leave. His doctors said it was fine. He would leave Saint-Remy and travel north to be nearer his brother Theo and Theo's new wife, who were living in Paris. And so he decided to move north to the town of Auvers-sur-Oise, which is a little town to the northwest of Paris. And he stopped off briefly with Theo on the way and then moved to Auvers. And he arrived in Auvers on the 20th of May, 1890. And we know, although he didn't, that he only had 2 more months to live. So this is absolutely shocking to feel that the end is approaching this rapidly of his short career. But he got there. He confessed to feeling disoriented. He was anxious. But he set about painting the surroundings in Auvers enthusiastically. He painted town scenes like this, the chestnut tree in one of the small streets in Auvers. He painted the beautiful thatched cottages that he saw. He described them ecstatically to Theo. They're so beautiful, these thatched cottages. I'm going to paint them, and I'm going to sell them, and I'm going to recoup the cost of my travel. Of course, he'd only sold one painting up until this point. Theo had not been able to sell the paintings that he sent to him. So, in fact, economically, Theo had to go on supporting him all the time. But he decided that he was going to paint a lot of these studies of thatched farms and cottages. We have this one in the exhibition from the Van Gogh Museum, and it is obviously a section of that farm that we're seeing there. It's a similar composition to that part there, which is a large work in the Tate. And you'll see that he's also experimenting with a new format here. Suddenly he's gone to these long horizontal compositions, which we'll see again in a moment. And these are the so-called double square pictures. They're essentially 2 squares wide. He then starts to paint wheat. He's fascinated by wheat, both as from a design point of view, and as a symbol of man's a sort of enduring struggle with agriculture and the earth, and the fact that it comes up season after season, and it's wonderfully emblematic of the peasant life that he had been exploring back in the Netherlands almost 10 years before. So he paints the study of wheat, which he describes very, very accurately in a letter to Gauguin, which in fact he never sent, but we still have the letter. And then he says, I've painted this study of wheat with all the little wildflowers and so on, and it would be the most wonderful background for portraits. So, and then just a little bit later, he realizes that plan and paints portraits against the wheaten background. This one, the one in the middle, we have in the exhibition. This one is in the National Gallery in Washington, but it's the same model. And he describes her to Theo. He says, I painted this peasant girl. She's wearing a blue blouse with orange dots, and I'm wearing my blue tie with yellow orange dots, especially just to mark that. And she's wearing a straw hat with a blue ribbon, and she has very red cheeks. He describes that in the letter. So this is the painting he's talking about. And so these are two of the great masterpieces of that final period in Auvers. And this is 1 month from his death. And finally, sorry, let's just come back. And finally, we have in the exhibition this very intriguing work on paper, double square format, of two women crossing the fields from the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio. And he describes again in a letter to Theo, yesterday I saw two women walking across the fields wearing straw hats, and I'd love to do a picture of them. And he does this very rapid a sketch, which possibly he's intending to turn into a larger painting, but he never makes it. So here, this is the typical scenery around the town of Auvers-sur-Oise, and the plateau in the background, the farmhouse there, the great green wheat fields here, and these are potato plants here. And these figures are very, very stylized. Again, orange dots on a blue background, complementary colors, and the two women with their straw hats. And we don't have it in the exhibition, but we have a reproduction of part of it. This was long considered to be Van Gogh's last painting because it was so symbolic of the road leading nowhere, the sinister black crows portending death. And in fact, we now know that it's a very late painting, but it wasn't the last thing he painted. But it is in the month of his death. And on the 27th of July, he shoots himself in one of these very wheat fields that's depicted here, and 2 days later he dies. And he's buried with Theo in the cemetery of Auvers-sur-Oise. Theo rushed to his side. At first it was thought that his injuries were not serious, that he would recover. But then he relapsed and died on the 29th of July 1890. And Theo, who was the younger brother, always had poor health, and he didn't live more than 6 months more than Vincent. So here are their dates. Vincent died July 29th, 1890, age 37. Theo died January 25th, 1891, age just 33. And it was Theo's widow, Jo, who basically collected all the works by Van Gogh that he'd been sending to Theo throughout the years, and made the two great collections that we now have in the Netherlands, the Van Gogh Museum and the Kröller-Müller Museum. Mrs. Kröller-Müller acquired a lot of those works and made that other collection. And it's from those two magnificent collections that the bulk of our exhibition is drawn. So thank you very much. Enjoy it. Thank you.